Hi everybody, it's Krish Kandaya here and welcome again to FAQ. I was going to call it Faith and Quarantine, or perhaps maybe frequently asked questions. We're in unprecedented times. I don't know how your day has been. We found out that our schools are closing on Friday, so all our kids are going to be home all the time. That's either going to be absolutely amazing or absolutely crazy. Yesterday we were thinking about Noah getting locked in to the ark, and I mentioned to you that we just have one cat, but our main conversation this evening is whether we're going to adopt a Rottweiler dog. Who knows? Anything can happen. My daughter found out today that her school isn't actually reopening and she has now finished secondary school forever, and that's a bit of a big deal because there wasn't a farewell, there wasn't a send-off, it all just kind of happened. So I'm sure your days have been more crazy than mine, but these are interesting moments, aren't they? Every moment the news is changing and we're not quite sure what's happening. And so how do you hold on to faith in these uncertain times? That's the question I really want to wrestle with this evening. And maybe you've got a question, maybe you want to make a comment. I'm really keen to make this interactive. That's why we're using Facebook Live, so you can press the like button, the sad face button, or you can raise a question. I'd love to hear from you. Let's see if we can make this time of social isolation actually good for us and good for our souls. It's definitely forcing us to have a different pace of life, isn't it? That we used to be rushing around doing everything, and now we've got to refocus and reframe who we are. As I said yesterday, I was looking at the story of Noah, and I thought today it might be fun to think about the story of Abraham. I'm basically thinking through the different characters in the Bible, different events in the Bible where people have to live in some form of social isolation. And Noah obviously was in isolation with his family while the storms and the floods were hitting. Well, Abraham had a very different experience of isolation, but there might be some resonances here. And again, we're trying to figure out, what does this mean for faith in lockdown or faith in quarantine? I'm going to use the book of Hebrews, which you might be familiar with. It's a New Testament letter. We're not quite sure who wrote it. It was definitely inspired by God. And as the book of Hebrews reflects back on the story of Abraham, it recognises the key elements that faith played in his life. So let me read you a few of the verses. We'll make comments as we go. And again, if you've got questions, feel free to share them. So Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8 says this: by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Let's think about that for a little bit and think how these verses, this story, might help us understand what faith in uncertain times looks like. I think the first thing to comment is faith goes. Have a look. By faith, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. The call of God on Abraham was for him to be socially isolated from everything that he knew. All of his friends, his family, his normal community, all of the foundations of his life, all of the normal structures that were there were taken from Abraham. And that was God's command. Now, there's a whole stream of theology and thinking out there that says God's only going to lead you or ask you to do things that make you healthier and wealthier. But Abraham was kind of worse off, if you like, as a result of obeying God. He had to leave his normal structures. He had to become socially isolated with his wife, Sarah, and they leave everything that they knew. And for many people in this moment, as we're asked to step away from our normal life, we're out of the normal routines, will our faith survive that? Has our faith really been faith in God, or has it been faith in the normal run-of-the-mill of things, the faith in the structures that have sustained us? And again, there's nothing wrong with structures sustaining you. If you're a part of a church, that's part of God's good plan for you, to have people around you that can support you. But sometimes those structures begin to take the place of God. Sometimes the things that we've been relying on stop us from actually relying on God. And we don't have a choice about this social isolation. And so I guess we will discover whether our faith really is in God or really just in the normal run of the mill of things. When Abraham does go, he goes to a faraway country, one that he hasn't known, he's got no previous background with, and he's only there not for any personal gain, but for what God has asked him to do. And for me, that's interesting, isn't it? In this moment when everything is different, will our faith actually withstand that? Will we be able to trust God in a new circumstance? The wider story of Abraham tells us that Abraham was kind of plucked out of what seemed to be relative obscurity. He lived in a place called Ur. It sounds odd in itself, doesn't it? And God said, look, he was going to bless Abraham, and through him, all the nations were going to be blessed. And that's interesting because I'm pretty sure in the ancient world, long distance travel was really unusual. It's actually quite unsafe. It's linked to why hospitality was such an important part of the ancient world culture, because there wasn't a hotel industry. If you went on a journey, you'd normally expect to stop off, and you might not have friends or relatives there. So you might have to rely on the kindness of strangers. So for Abraham, his picture of what the world would look like and what the world that was going to be blessed through him was going to look like was pretty uncertain. And it's almost as if God's kind of saying, okay, well, let me show you a bit of that world. Let me take you out of your comfort zone and put you in a brand new place. And for many of us, this isolation, even though we're in the surroundings of our home, it is a brand new place for us. It's a brand new season. And every day with the news changing about what is going to be normal, can we go to work? Will our kids go to school? Will Amazon keep delivering? Will we be able to watch sport? All of these things are changing, and will we be able to trust God in this new place? And I guess one thing we could also ask ourselves about the Abraham story is, when we're in this new place, will we continue seeking the blessing of all those around us? That's my hope with these little videos, that as you watch them, they're an encouragement to you, they're a blessing to you. We've got, as I said the other day, a little WhatsApp group in our neighborhood where we're trying to figure out how we can bless and help each other as the virus comes, as people have less ability to get out and buy their shopping. Will we be able to be a blessing? So I think that's the first kind of thoughts I've got around the beginning of this story. Faith goes. But did you notice the kind of corollary of that is that faith makes a home? Verse 9, by faith, Abraham made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. I don't know if you've ever been a stranger in a foreign country, and not just for a bit of tourism, but actually trying to settle down and live somewhere. My wife and I experienced that when we were cross-cultural missionaries living in Albania. And at the beginning, it's incredibly hard to get used to a new culture, a new way of living. It's particularly difficult if you don't speak the language. That really isolates you. And yet Abraham, his faith worked out by him settling down. So faith put him on the move in the first place. And then faith is what helps him to settle down and get used to this new normal. And for me, I guess in this moment, will we be able to make a home in this new environment? We'll be able to have a sense of security and stability even in all of this upheaval. That, I guess, is what a faith response have, that ultimately our confidence is not in the normal structures, it's not in the state, it's not in the healthcare system. Our faith is ultimately in God. That's where we're going to be able to make a home. We're going to be able to make a home anywhere because God is our ultimate foundation. God is our ultimate security. And that comes out a little bit in this passage. Have a look. He said he lived in tents. Abraham lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, his son and grandson, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. That's a funny little juxtaposition, isn't it? That Abraham and his descendants, they live in tents, But they do that, and a tent obviously doesn't have foundation. You don't need an architect for a tent, but they do that because their security is actually not found in their home and their dwelling, but it's found in God's provision, and God is the one who provides the foundation. God is the ultimate architect. And I love that. You know, what a challenge to me. You know, I'm a guy that likes to be out and about, being busy, making new connections. I get a lot of buzz out of you know, speaking and encouraging people, and I can't do that in the same way here. And so that's kind of asking me questions about my identity and my sense of security, isn't it? Is my security ultimately in my performance, in my routine, in the praise that I get from other people, or is my security actually in God? And the way that worked out for Abraham was, okay, he left what seems to be quite an affluent lifestyle behind to go and live in a tent in a foreign country, but by faith he was able to make that his home. He was able to find security in an insecure time. And I think that's a real challenge to us. Who knows how long our time of isolation will be. It may be months, it may be longer. Who knows, once we emerge out the other side of this thing, whether life will be going back to what it used to be. You know, my daughter found out today that there aren't going to be A-levels. So will she go to university? Will she be able to study what she's been preparing so long for? And part of my job as a dad in that circumstance is to try and provide some kind of stability and hope and security. And I've not got a lot of ability to do that. I'm not in control of a lot of things. And so the best I can do in these circumstances is try to point my kids to God. I'm nervous and worried, but I've got to try and find some kind of confidence in God that I can transmit and encourage and support my kids with, and my family with. And so maybe that's your circumstance too. And again, if you've got questions about what that looks in practice, please let me know. Maybe you've got suggestions of good ways forward. We've been trying just as a discipline, I guess, and maybe you know, part of the routine of our day, the new routine in this uncertain time, is the Bible passage that I'm thinking of talking to you about. I talk to my family about over dinner. We try to tease out what the story has to say, what the similarities or dissimilarities with our circumstances are, and what we might be able to learn. And so, I mean, that leads me to the last point I have for you this evening. Faith finds life even in death. Have a look at these verses. Verse 11 of chapter 11 of Hebrews. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who has made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. That's interesting, isn't it? And be careful here. Maybe you know that I run a fostering and adoption charity, and for many people, fostering and adoption is linked with fertility. And many people that come forward for fostering and adoption, they come in because they haven't been able to have their own birth children. And at one level, of course, adoption, fostering is a brilliant way to form a family if that's your background. But at another level, these things are disconnected, because many people that come forward for adoption, what they really want is a baby, and the children that are waiting to be adopted are older, 5, 6, 7 years old, and maybe in a sibling group, maybe with additional needs. And so I've been trying for a long time to tease apart this idea that adoption is only for people who can't have birth children. Actually, lots of us could be brilliant parents to children in the care system. Our family stories was that we had 3 birth kids and then we thought about fostering and adoption. Maybe that's your story too. But sometimes I come across churches and they'll say something like, well, you know, all the people in the Old Testament who were infertile, if they trusted God, they had children. Well, that's not actually true. There's a few instances where that happens, but that's nowhere promised. And we don't want to link the idea of infertility and faith. It's not that people who have more faith have more children or have the ability to have children. That's not true. I've met many atheists and people with all sorts of different faith backgrounds that have children. So there's no way that faith and fertility are linked in that way. That doesn't seem to be the way that God works. But I think all we're supposed to hear in this story is, look, there is no natural means by which Abraham and Sarah could have had children. Abraham was past age, and the Bible passage here says Sarah was barren. And I think what we're supposed to be hearing here is the supernatural origins of the nation of Israel. Their whole existence, the father of their nation was only able to have children because of the grace and faith of God. Okay, I think that's the big idea here. And that's why their infertility is emphasized. The very existence of the nation is completely dependent on God. And it's a miracle that they exist in the first place. But the line I really enjoyed, maybe you like it too, maybe you feel like it at the moment, is this, verse 12. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead. How do you like that? Abraham was as good as dead. So if you're wondering about kind of vulnerable populations, people that have underlying health conditions, Abraham definitely had a whole bunch of them. He was as good as dead. And yet, faith brought life out of this death situation. And for me, I think that has kind of wider implications. In the midst of all this fear and anxiety, could God redeem this moment and help people find life in the midst of death? Could this be used as a wake-up call? I think about the hours and days and maybe weeks after the 9/11 disaster, where so many people in different parts of the world died, and that moment was awful, and it was evil, and it was a man-made terror event. And yet God somehow redeemed that. I met many people who in those days afterwards began to question what life was all about. And actually many people I met became Christians, became followers of Jesus in the aftermath of that. It became like a wake up to them about what really mattered. And so I wonder, even in the middle of this coronavirus, as you know, we're worried about our loved ones, we're worried about ourselves, we're in a different phase, a different moment. I wonder whether that could be a wake-up call, and whether life could come out of death. I remember reading the story of Alfred Nobel. Maybe that name rings a bell with you. He had a weird experience in 1888. He read an obituary, and it was a pretty gruesome, horrible obituary. It told you that the person that had died, they were kind of quite pleased he was dead. Because he had been a merchant of death. He'd been an arms manufacturer. Many people around the world had been killed or mutilated as a result of his inventions. And the weird thing was that Alfred Nobel was reading his own obituary. Maybe it was sloppy journalism, maybe it was just a kind of typo, but actually his brother Ludwig Nobel had died. And somehow the newspaper report had written that Alfred Nobel had died. And the story goes that Alfred Nobel was so shocked by just the brutality of this obituary and just the terrible negative reputational legacy he was going to leave behind. It was a wake-up call to him. And so Alfred Nobel started to give away his wealth and made a huge legacy contribution, an incredibly rich man. And he endowed the Nobel Peace Prize. How weird is that for an origin story? The most famous peace prize in the world was founded by a former arms manufacturer. And it was being confronted with his own death that Alfred Nobel needed to think about what life was about. And I wonder if that might be true for you or for people that you know. Whether in the middle of these uncertain times we can find out what life is really for. It is a terrible moment. We need to be thinking about how to invest our lives into other people. This virus, this pandemic can be bringing the worst out of people. We've seen it in the shots. We've seen it in some of the ways that people have been behaving on Twitter, talking callously about how this older generation are being purged and got rid of. Well, that is not how a Christian looks at the world. It's not how God looks at the world. I love the fact that Abraham and Sarah are the heroes of this story, even though they were as good as dead, even though the world might have written them off as dispensable, they became absolutely essential in God's plan for making a difference in the world and blessing all the nations. And so as we draw this to a close, again, if you have questions, happy to answer them. If you've got a suggestion of a question we should be wrestling with, or a Bible passage we should be looking at tomorrow, I wonder whether you might think about what your faith is going to look like in these uncertain times. Can you learn from Abraham about a faith that's willing to go and trust God in new circumstances? A faith that's willing to be obedient even though we don't know what's ahead. A faith that's willing to not just be receiving of blessing, but passing on a blessing to others. I wonder whether you can find encouragement or challenge from Abraham about having a faith that makes a home in uncertain and difficult circumstances, a home that finds its security not in buildings or in wealth or even in health, but a faith that finds its home security in God and God's provision. And I wonder whether your faith can find life in the face of death, and whether that's something that we can begin to offer to other people, that through our trust in God and through going and showing a sense of security in the world that's independent of our circumstances, we can help other people find life too. I hope this has been helpful. Love to hear from you. Please leave me a comment. Help me know if this is useful to you, or if you've got suggestions how I can make it better. Tomorrow is a brand new day, another opportunity to learn more, lean more into God in these difficult circumstances. And I'll aim to post another video tomorrow evening around 7:45. So tune in again then. Otherwise, have a look in the back catalogue. There's the story of Noah and what we can learn from him. And tomorrow we'll pick up the story with a new character, and look forward to hearing from you. Who knows, we may have adopted a Rottweiler dog by then. Not what I was planning to do. I think we might be panic buying a puppy. Watch this space. Who knows how the story will end? I don't know. All right, take care. God bless you all. See you soon.